Hello and welcome to the Housing, Learning and Work Conference hosted by the Learning and Work Institute and Communities That Work. My name's Stephen Evans. I'm the Chief Executive of the Learning and Work Institute. Really pleased to welcome, I think, well north of 300 people registered for today's event. Firstly, a word of thanks to our sponsors. So a big thank you to our lead sponsors, ABRI. And thank you also to our group sponsors, City and Guilds, Clarion Futures, Metropolitan Thames Valley and Sovereign. So a big thank you to all of those sponsors for their support. Without that, we wouldn't be able to put on events like today. Now, it's, I think, just around about a year since we last held this conference. And I think it'd be fair to say it's not been exactly the year that most of us expected. I mean, well done if you predicted all of this, and perhaps you could let me have your lottery numbers later. So I think the pandemic has had a really profound effect on the labour market. We've seen the number of people claiming unemployment-related benefits double since March 2020. That would have been much worse without the furlough scheme protecting millions of jobs. And we've seen particularly households with lower incomes taking a hit to their incomes, and many groups struggling to sort of manage money and manage those finances, having faced reduced incomes for various reasons, reduced hours, furloughing, or indeed losing their jobs. So it's been a really profound effect. We're now in a place where hopefully things will start to get a bit better thanks to the excellent rollout of the vaccine programme. And we can start to think about how we look to recover from the effects of the pandemic, but also renew and aim for a better vision of the future, not just going back to how things were. Now, housing associations and the wider social housing sector have always been on the front line of employment and skills support. We're going to hear loads of great examples during the course of today of the work done to support residents during the pandemic and before, and also about plans for the future as well. So I know there's lots of great work going on. I'm interested to hear about that and hear about how we can make things better for the future, how we can build back better, as the title of the conference goes. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to pass over to Lindsay Sweeney, the Managing Director of Communities That Work, to say a few words of introduction too. So Lindsay, over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Stephen, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone, this morning. As Stephen said, we've trebled the delegates who've been able to join us from a year ago, and I can only echo the thanks of our sponsors for enabling us to run this conference this morning. And also, I'd like to thank all the speakers and the chairs who you're going to meet and hear from this morning in various sessions that you're all involved with. So thank you very much. I'm really interested and delighted to be here this morning. Time is tight on the schedule, and we've got a lot to get through. So my sort of 1 minute reflection on why the social housing sector matters, why we run these conferences with our colleagues at the Learning and Work Institute, and why we exist as an organisation is hard to encapsulate. But I suppose I look to the future in things like the ESG agenda in housing, so the environmental, social and governance drive, which is really gaining pace now across the housing sector, and shows a really serious institutional direction of travel around the importance of the stewardship of the housing sector and what we exist to do, but at a very fundamental investor-led level. And I think after the year we've had, I'm really heartened that the social housing sector is on the front foot for that type of investment agenda and is putting environmental and social and governance into the centre of its being. In the social, there is an awful lot to unpack, but housing and employment is completely key. There's a lot swirling around the housing sector at the moment. And there's a lot of competing pressures and priorities, as there always will be. But after this year, which we've experienced, we know that jobs are more important than ever, and skills are more important than ever. So I really feel that the social housing sector has always had a key role to play, but now it places itself more front and centre into that role. And I hope to hear loads through today on the ways in which we do that and the possibilities for future partnership. I think our speakers will say far more eloquently than I can, not least our next one from the Resolution Foundation, the state of affairs that we find ourselves in. So I'll leave our colleagues to do that. But I did want to mention from the social housing perspective, just the importance of employment and, of course, the experience of the last year. We know at Communities That Work, in some of our own member-led research representing over 1 million homes owned and managed, that virtually 100% of our landlords, 96%, are experiencing a greater demand for services to do with financial support, and 70% are seeing direct increases in support for employment and training support directly from their tenant bases to the landlord. So they are really significant jumps in a year of significant unprecedented jumps on charts. But for the social housing sector, those really matter. And they mean that we need to do something collectively about it. No sector is an island, and I think today is going to be about partnerships. And I hope that all delegates here today, from whichever side of the sectors you're in, housing or learning or employment, will be able to forge some partnerships and seek follow-up from today. So there's some of my hopes today and my thanks. I've got some very brief housekeeping notes. You should all have been sent and seen an interactive programme for today. Please do take a moment to refer to that. There's a couple of links and information points in there which you can find your way through as you open up the document. There's also a QR code in there. If you want to scan that, you can enter the Slido version of events for polls and Q&A alongside watching on screen or through 2 tabs on your laptop, as you prefer. But if you've never used Slido before, then just use the QR code and it's super easy to join and be involved through the day. So we hope it's as interactive as possible. And you know, we understand that it's not quite the same as standing in a room with a cup of tea and chatting to people, but we hope that you will take the chance to use the chat box and the Q&A and make connections. If you're in social media, please use the hashtag #HousingLearningWork for any comments that you want to share or any posts or images from today. And from Communities That Work's perspective, please note that you can direct message us on Twitter anytime through today. We'll be keeping an eye on that if you want to say hello or have a particular question for us. Okay, my last point is to remind everyone that we opened a poll that was sent prior to the start of the event this morning, but it's still open. So our poll number 1 is still live. And here's a reminder of that poll. So you can participate, use your vote wisely on Slido, and the results of that poll will come through the day. And there will also be a couple of other polls through the day so we can take the temperature of the delegates and see what you're thinking and feeling. So thank you for that. And without further ado, we'll move on time to our first keynote, in which I'm really delighted to welcome the Resolution Foundation and the Deputy Chief Executive, Mike Brewer. I have to say, from my perspective, the Resolution Foundation have had a really storming year of briefings and information, which has been prescient and really on the button, really clear analysis of what's been happening in this unexpected year. And I've learnt a lot through events and briefings from the Resolution Foundation in this last year. So we're delighted to have them here. By way of introduction, Mike is Chief Economist and Deputy Chief Executive at the Resolution Foundation. He's been there since 2020. Prior to that was a Professor of Economics at the University of Essex. So there will, I hope, be some slides with some technical information that Mike can take us through to attempt to answer a very simple question, which is what is happening in the labour market. So Mike, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, for that nice introduction. We move on to the first slide, please. I think, as Stephen and Lindsay have both said, the big picture actually for the labour market is, yes, it's been bad, but it could have been an awful lot worse. So this chart is updated with Tuesday's latest unemployment data, showing unemployment's now ticked up from 4% to 5%. That's hardly any increase at all, really, when compared to the massive fall in economic activity last year, or even to the fall in the number of hours worked. Now, there are some issues with the unemployment data at the moment, and the green line on that chart shows what we think unemployment shows, perhaps a more accurate measure of unemployment when we add in lots of people who say they have a job but aren't getting paid at the moment because of coronavirus, but are not on furlough. That might take it towards 6%. But even so, I say that's a far smaller rise than we might have expected given the fall in economic activity. And as Stephen said at the beginning, that is almost entirely due to the job retention scheme, which has prevented the crisis from turning into a major unemployment crisis. Move on, please, to the next slide. We do also know that this crisis has been concentrated very heavily on certain sectors, the ones that have been most affected by social distancing restrictions or told to shut down entirely during our various lockdowns. This chart, again, using data came out on Tuesday, looking at the fall in employee jobs, according to the real-time data from HMRC, showing the large falls in hospitality, retail, manufacturing still, that's not crisis related, of course, and then arts, entertainment and recreation, and showing the rise in employment, again, unsurprisingly, in health and social work at the top. Grab the next slide, please. And then what that means in turn is that the crisis is bearing down heavily on people who work in those sectors. So changing data sources again, this is data from a survey we did in January of 6,000 working age adults. If you look at the bottom, what we did was we looked at all the people who were in work a year ago and asked what they were doing in January. The black bars show the fraction who are not working anymore. The red bars show those who are furloughed. The blue bars show those who've lost earnings for other reasons. At the bottom, you can see the sectors which are affected, which of course line up with what we know from other sources of data. And people who work in hospitality, non-food retail, arts, entertainment, the leisure sector, they do tend to be young and they do tend to be fairly low paid. And that's reflected in the other bars on the slide. So that the experience of losing your job altogether or being furloughed or seeing your earnings cut is much more common amongst low paid than high paid workers. And it's much more common amongst the young, under 25s, and also a little bit across those age 55 or over. So a very skewed impact on certain groups. We'd have the next slide, please. Also in Tuesday's data, there was a bit of a hint that things are getting better. In fact, the number of employee jobs went up in the latest month of data. This chart is looking at vacancies, which are also improving. I'm not showing you the time series here, I'm just showing it by sector. So vacancies in the latest data have made up half of the fall that we initially saw back in April. So it's clearly not yet back to normal, of course, but we've made up, say, half of the fall that we saw at the beginning of the crisis. This is showing you the sectors in which vacancies have fallen. They've basically fallen in almost all sectors. The blue circle is where we were before the crisis started, and the black and the dark blue squares are where we are now, with the largest falls, again, unsurprisingly, in hospitality, which I can see I spelt wrongly on that slide, retail and retail. But as I say, vacancies have fallen across the economy. Next slide, please. And then we tried to look ahead in our recent work, in our January survey. We asked people who were in work in January what they were expecting to happen over the next few months. Now, of course, this is an ever-changing situation. At the time, we were asking people, the furlough scheme was expected to end at the end of April, and that may have been in respondents' mind when they answered this. but it's clear that worries about job security are high, or indeed, this chart on this chart, the red bar is showing you people who expect to lose their job, and the green bar those who definitely will lose their job, with the blue bar showing those whose employer has announced redundancies. So across all workers in January, 7% expected to lose their job in the following 3 months. This was unsurprisingly, again, much higher in the shutdown sectors of hospitality, non-food retail and leisure. It was 14%, 1 in 7 workers, and it's higher amongst those who were furloughed. And I think there is a sense in which the year just passed, we may have escaped the worst of the labour market crisis, but instead it's really the year ahead that we've got to worry a bit more. I'll come back to that in my comments at the end. If we go on to the next slide, please. And I think this is perhaps the slide I want you to take from the most. So we, again, from our own survey in January, we're trying to get at the extent of long-term unemployment. And so we asked people how long they've been unemployed, and our estimates were in January about 0.7 million people had been unemployed for at least 6 months. And obviously it's long-term unemployment, which poses the biggest risk to people, has the most damaging effects in terms of their subsequent work probabilities or their future wages. And it's the real policy challenge for the government in the next year. We also found another 500,000 people who'd been on full furlough for at least 6 months. So they also hadn't done any work for 6 months, but they did have their connection with their employer at least, and were getting at least 80% of their earnings. But I think as we move into 2021, as the job retention scheme runs out, it's going to really matter what happens to people who have been on furlough. Now, if you've been on full furlough and you're brought back by your employer, then that's fine. The government doesn't need to worry about it. Policymakers shouldn't worry too much. But there will be some people who have been furloughed for a long time and then just move from furlough to unemployment. And that means, and that's just as bad as being unemployed for a long period of time. And that's how I'm getting down to explaining the first row, the first bar on that chart. So when we looked at the number of people who hadn't worked for 6 months because they'd either been unemployed or full furloughed, that was nearly 2 million, and we were really surprised by that. And I think that could be one of the key challenges as we go into 2021, not just the extent of long-term unemployment, but the extent to which a large group of people haven't done any work at all for long periods of time. If we go on to the next slide, please. And I think the other challenge, or the other thing which you and your conference need to bear in mind, is that this year coming up, 2021, it could also be the year in which there's a lot of churn, a lot of change going on in the labour market. And we basically gummed up the labour market for the past year with the job retention scheme, with a collapse in hiring. And so I think there's a lot of pent-up demand to move. So we asked people directly whether they were expecting to move sectors next year, and the results are in the blue bar. And in the yellow bars, we're showing you the amount of sector-to-sector moves you would expect in a normal year. So normally you'd expect 4% of workers to change sectors in a 12-month period. In our survey, about double that, 8% of people were expecting to change. As you might expect, the number of people wanting or expecting to change sector was much higher amongst those who are currently in one of the shutdown sectors, hospitality, retail, and so on. And there could be lots of reasons for this. Or it could be some people who are in one of these shutdown sectors who've decided, okay, there's just not enough job security there, I need to get out. It's time to move into a sector that's less dependent or less susceptible to the virus. And there could be other people who in the past year have taken jobs, maybe they lost a job because of coronavirus, they take another job as a stopgap, and maybe they're hoping next year to move back to a sector they'd rather work in. So for both of those reasons, yeah, it could well be a year where there's a lot of movement, a lot of churn in the labour market. Thank you. The next slide, please. So I'll just quickly run through what our policy recommendations were, our policy calls were. The current plan still is for the job retention scheme to end at the end of April, although of course the Chancellor will be returning to that next week in the budget. What we called for a couple of weeks ago was that we thought that should go on for at least 2 more months to the end of June, and then to be phased out, and then even then to be phased out gradually. So certainly the job retention scheme needs to carry on for as long as there are restrictions on economic activity anywhere. And so again, as with the government's roadmap, the focus should be on data, not dates. Whilst we are shutting down bits of hospitality or bits of leisure or the arts, then the job retention scheme should carry on existing. And even after that, it should be phased out slowly. When it is phased out, our suggestion is that it's phased out by increasing the minimum hours requirements rather than just increasing employer contributions. And the next slide, please. We'd also like the government to come up with a better targeted support for the self-employed, both to bring in people who were initially excluded, but also to focus it more on people who have genuinely suffered losses due to the pandemic. Next slide, thank you. And then returning to my theme about long-term worklessness, obviously the government has got to get right employment support next year. Our first recommendation, given the number of people who've been long-term furloughed and who then might go straight onto unemployment, is that we think that work coaches, Job Centre Plus, should be given the discretion to count time on full furlough as time spent unemployed when deciding who should move on to Kickstart or Restart. So if somebody was on full furlough for 11 months and then made unemployed straight away and spends 1 month on universal credit, we think that should count as being unemployed for 12 months in order so that somebody could get on to a Kickstart or Restart program. Again, we just need to focus on people who've been long-term out of work and not pay too much attention about whether that was on furlough or on the officially unemployed. And secondly, it's clear we're going to need something like the Kickstart scheme well beyond 2021, so it should be extended into the following year. And then lastly, the final slide is that so far the government has done a great deal to prevent a rise in unemployment. It's been preventing that rise in unemployment. It's now got to invest in encouraging job creation. And we think it should do that. Well, there's many ways in which it could do that. Our recommendations are a targeted wage subsidy for hardest hit sectors, perhaps a rise in the employer national insurance threshold for firms that are expanding, and expanding eligibility for level 3 training courses for those people who do need to change sectors because perhaps the pandemic has made their previous job or previous sector unviable. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you, Mike. That's a really comprehensive run through, and I'm hoping that we can share that information in a follow-on pack from today. So thanks ever so much. I've got a couple of questions, but I do note, Mike, if you can stay on for 5-10 minutes, we've got a couple of questions popping in also from Slido, if that's all right. I'll take chair's privilege and ask you if I know what your policy recommendations are, but I wonder whether you have any predictions for what is going to come in the spring budget next week. How close do you think the government will follow the recommendations of the Resolution Foundation? If you were a betting man, how likely do you think the government will be to take up your policy recommendations? So that was my first question, and then I'll, in a second, Mike, ask from the audience if you could elaborate on the recommendation that you make about better targeted support for the self-employed. So if you don't mind taking that quite large question and then a very specific question together, that would be great. Thanks, Mike.
Yes, I'll try and do that. I can't claim any great insights into what the Chancellor is dreaming up. We do, of course, talk to the Treasury, but I don't know what's going to be in the budget. But we do seem to have seen a change in the Treasury's strategy, certainly compared to last summer, when it seemed very keen to phase out the schemes as soon as possible. And as a result, it got itself sort of tangled in a real mess in the autumn when we were going back into lockdown and ended up in that crazy period in October and November, changing its job retention support policy several times during a month. So it seems to have moved out of that phase now, and they do seem to have accepted that the job retention scheme and related support schemes, whether that be loans for businesses, grants for those that are shut down, and the self-employment grant, it does seem to accept that those have to carry on while there are restrictions. So I'm expecting the Chancellor to extend all of those things at least until July, maybe until September. So that's the job retention scheme, self-employment grants, grants directly to shut down businesses and hospitality and so on, and possibly also loans. I think they will carry on. The government does seem to have seen the light there. What I'm much less sure about, and indeed we're quite worried, is whether the government will do much, as I was saying, to actively encourage, actively stimulate job creation. So yes, it's done a great job at preventing unemployment crisis, but we're still going to be we're now in a conventional recession, and normally in a recession, you do expect governments to come in there and provide some kind of fiscal stimulus to the economy in general, and ideally some kind of support at employers to encourage them to hire more people. Unemployment is going to be high. It's not going to go down quickly of its own accord. I think the government do need to do more there, and that's where I'm a little bit concerned that we might not see as much from the government as we would like to find. And then on the self-employment question, I mean, this is, I didn't say too much, thinking this is more about employees in this conference, but yeah, obviously there are well-known problems with some self-employed people being excluded from existing schemes, and now we have HMRC have another tax years and information on another tax year. I think it would be a very, very obvious thing to do to allow people to use their tax returns for 1920 to establish eligibility to the scheme. But on the flip side, we have also pointed out that in the early stages of the self-employment grant scheme, it was very poorly targeted. In other words, it went to self-employed people who were allowed to claim it without too much checks on whether they genuinely suffered losses. And I think as we move into the final phase of it, hopefully the final phase of this crisis, if we are going to see a fifth self-employment grant, then I think we would be supportive of measures which limited it to certain sectors of the economy and or which required a much greater burden of proof on the self-employed to show they had losses. So yeah, let's carry on being generous where governments have told you can't operate. But I think let's also take care we don't spray money around unnecessarily where we don't have to.
Thank you, Mike. There's often keen interest in self-employment from the housing sector, who do quite a lot to support tenants and residents into starting their own jobs or small businesses. So thank you for covering that off in detail. Just for the last couple of minutes and keeping an eye on the questions that are popping in, there's a couple which have come in around long-term unemployment and skills and reskilling. And you touched very clearly, Mike, on quite arresting statistic around a doubling, really, of people who expect to move from one sector to another in this year, seeking other work as some sectors diminish and others begin to grow or re-emerge. So we think that's quite an interesting prospect for the year ahead, and we're keen to understand ways in which that skills shift will follow into government policy and ways to support people into a transition. So I think my quick two-part question is, in terms of long-term unemployment, how concerned is the Resolution Foundation? How concerned are you, Mike, about a new generation of entrenched long-term unemployment coming from this one-year employment crisis so far? And perhaps in a glimmer of hope, to what extent do you think, or what policy recommendations do you have to make that skills shift as simple and as easy as possible to perhaps help prevent some of that long-term unemployment from taking hold in people's lives and communities and households?
Thank you. I think we are very concerned that not that long-term employment will become entrenched, but that young people who've been affected by the crisis will suffer a permanent, we call it a wage scar. What we know from the evidence is that if you have a long period of time unemployed, even if you're young, that shows up in your subsequent earnings and your subsequent job prospects. So it's not that it becomes entrenched in long-term unemployment, in permanent unemployment, but you do see the scar persisting throughout someone's career. And I think there is a very real risk that will happen to some of today's generation of young people. because the crisis has now gone on for so long. You know, if it had been a short, sharp shock for 3 months, it would have been fine. But it's been it will have been over a year, and our estimates of the number of people who haven't done any work because of some mixture of unemployment or full furlough were quite alarming. And that was in January. It seemed a long time from January through to June when we're hopefully back to normal. So yes, it's a real worry. What could the government do? I mean, policies like Kickstart and Restart are absolutely the right thing to do. So we made, we think the government's plans for Kickstart will stop too soon. So we think that should be carried on through 2022. Restart is absolutely the right idea. And as I say, we think that time spent on full furlough should probably count as time unemployed when working out who can be fast tracked through to the services offered by Restart. And then in terms of training, yeah, what we would like the government to do is to change the rules so that people are able to access funding to retrain in a different sector to level 3, not just to gain level 3 qualifications for the first time. And we think that single change could really help people make the switch between sectors. I mean, it's needed for other reasons too. We know there are skills shortages of people to work in social care. That's a booming sector. You know, we should be doing things to allow workers who've seen their jobs disappear to change sectors. So I think that single policy could make a big difference, or that's a big funding ask for government too. But yeah, there should be a really strong focus on broadening people's horizons as well as facilitating that change in sector where they want to do that.
Fantastic, thank you, Mike. There's some really clear and I hope I casually say very doable things for the government to do there. But I like those clear recommendations. From conference, huge thanks to you, Mike, and to the Resolution Foundation for joining us and kicking off the conference with such comprehensive information about the labour market. So thank you, and thanks to the delegates for sharing some questions and thoughts there. Okay, my last piece of housekeeping before I pass to to my co-chair Stephen and the plenary panel is to let you know that poll number one is done. Poll number 2 is new, so please have a look on Slido, and a brief aid to memories here. This is poll 2, and you'll be encouraged to use your vote once again, and maybe think about what you've heard this morning so far, and where you think we're headed, and choose some, make your priorities known in this poll. Of course, you can continue to vote in this poll through this plenary panel, and I think Stephen will be picking up on some of the results as we go through the rest of the morning. So, Stephen, without further ado, I'll hand over to you and look forward to hearing from all our panelists as we go into the next plenary. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Lindsay, and thanks to Mike as well. I think that gives us a really helpful scene setter for the day in terms of where the labour market is so far, and that sharp rise in unemployment, but the furlough scheme doing its job and limiting that rise, coupled with this sort of where do we go now, and how do we open up the economy, but allow people to get the support that they need and to retrain if they need to do so. How quickly will the economy bounce back? And how do we make sure people get the jobs as they bounce back as well? And in particular, struck by Mike's point about this new category of long-term furlough that we kind of have, and how we make sure that if people in that group don't have jobs to go back to, that we support them well. So as Lindsay said, please do vote in the poll. Vote early and vote often is our motto, so please do get voting on that. Please do carry on putting your questions into the Q&A on Slido as well, and we'll try and bring some of those out as we go into the Q&A part of the panel session here, and do continue tweeting away using the hashtag housing learning work as well. That's my various forms of communication plugged, I think, there. So we've got a great panel to discuss some of those issues that Mike was running us through earlier. So what I'm going to do is introduce each of them in turn and ask each of them to just speak for a few minutes to give their perspectives on all of this, and then, as I say, we'll kind of go into a Q&A discussion. So do keep putting your various Q's and A's in there as well. So I will come to each of the panelists in the order in which you are named on this slide to give you fair warning in advance, so you're not taken by surprise when I suddenly turn to you. And so first up, we have Ralph Facey, who is the Executive Director of Operations at ABRI, and we're very pleased, as I said earlier, to have ABRI as our lead sponsor for today. And Ralph, I'm interested in the impact of the pandemic on your residents, how you've supported them through this crisis, and what your plans are in terms of how we build back better, to coin a phrase. So Ralph, I'll pass over to you to speak first, please.
Thanks, Stephen, and good morning, everyone. Housing associations have been community anchors for generations, and ABRI's roots go back to the 1920s, with a long tradition of community investment and employment work across our 37 local authority areas. Maintained during difficult times, and that's where we are at the moment. And in mid-2019, we were really concerned about the gap between rich and poor and the lack of opportunities that were occurring in key communities. So evidence of poverty, some polarisation, and a kind of sense of community powerlessness. So with the Bayswater Institute, we looked at a whole range of data, IMD data, public health data, our own housing management, cost and performance data. And we found 8,000 homes in the top 30% most deprived communities in England. And as you'd expect, there were a range of issues. So what to do? Heavily influenced by Cormac Russell's ABCD community development model, and conscious that we had to avoid being overly paternalistic, we set aside £15 million over 5 years of our financial plan. And we've chosen to invest in 8 community investment zones, that's 11 neighbourhoods. And the kind of strategic pillars we're focusing on are empowerment, health and well-being, and employment, critically employment. And we believe that combination is what will help with community development. Now, the significant consultation exercise during lockdown, we've got our neighbourhood plans. There's differing needs in different communities. We've got a governance structure that is now obviously monitoring delivery. But above all, we believe community cohesion and the communities that work ethos, that's the springboard that's going to be necessary in recovery. So finally, Stephen, just to make sort of a few key points, no organisation on its own has the answer. Empowered communities and people actually are what is needed to find their answer. Collaboration is vital, and we're proud of the work with Optivo, Clarion, and communities that work, and 180 people into work this year, numerous self-employment businesses, but actually now it's about looking forward, post-pandemic, many challenges that we face, and frankly, joint effort is what is required to tackle those. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ralph. And I think the points about empowerment of people and collaboration, given the sort of multiple facets of this crisis and actually where we were before, I think are kind of really important. We've got loads of great examples from social housing that we're picking up during the course of the conference of doing that, including the ones that you mentioned there. So we'll definitely come on to some of that through the discussion. But I'm going to introduce our second speaker, James Reed, who's the Chairman and Chief Executive of the Reed Group of Companies. Reed is Britain's largest recruitment company, and the group also includes Reed in Partnership, which I think many people will know as one of the largest providers of employment support. So James, we were kind of hearing a little bit earlier from Mike from the Resolution Foundation about vacancies starting to bounce back a little bit, but still below pre-pandemic levels, and particular sectors that we can all guess still affected. I guess I'm kind of interested in your perspective about the impact of the pandemic on the labour market, and also where we go from here to try and get as many people back to work as quickly as possible.
Hello, Stephen. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to join your conference. It's an honour to be with you. I thought Mike's comments were incredibly interesting, and also their recommendations. I hope someone's listening, because they were, to me, they made total sense. I'd like to begin really by just mentioning an article I read in the Financial Times in the beginning of April last year, and it was by the author Arundhati Roy. She's a wonderful writer, and she wrote an article called "The Pandemic is a Portal." And I'll just quote you from the last part of the article. She said, "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with their past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next." And I think that message of the pandemic as a portal really stayed with me, and it's sort of informed my thinking about it pretty much ever since. And sort of what I'm interested in now is what's the next normal? What will things look like as we emerge? And how has the world changed? And we saw the change very dramatically last spring, because our website, read.co.uk, typically at that time had 250,000 jobs advertised. The number of jobs advertised dropped by 72% in 6 weeks. So you can see, the suddenness. We'd never seen anything like that in 60 years in business. So this was the most dramatic recession that we had seen, and it's come out subsequently in the data around the economy and obviously, regrettably, unemployment. But the points I'd like to stress, there are two particular side effects that I'm concerned about. I think the most disadvantaged people have been hit hardest by this, and I mean the youngest and the oldest in the workforce. I mean people from BAME backgrounds, and I mean women as well. Because a lot of those people were employed in what we might typically describe as face-to-face activities that were obviously incredibly restricted as a result of lockdowns, and continue to be. I'm thinking obviously of leisure, retail, hospitality, many of those areas. And the other thing that's emerged is I think there's a real danger that we have what I'd call a two-speed workforce. I mean, one of the interesting things that came out of the recent ONS data that Mike just referred to is that wages had actually risen by 5% last year. They'd risen for the people who were still working, or for the people who were working from home, and they're actually better off. But the people who have to many of people working key worker roles, or obviously people who are furloughed or unemployed, are most definitely not better off. So this is a big challenge for the economy and for society, I think, going forward, to address these two phenomena. The third thing I'd say is for me, this crisis, I like to say crisis is the enemy of inertia. And we have seen unprecedented action from government. A year ago, it would have been unimaginable that some of the things that they've introduced, and actually pretty quickly. But it's forced changes, and it's forced changes in the way we live and work. And I think the longer the pandemic goes on, and Mike mentioned, it had been 3 months, it might have had a more limited effect, but the longer it goes on, the more those changes become embedded. And some of them might be good and some of them might not be. But I think we're going to see enduring changes coming out of this. And I think what we've also seen, which is encouraging, is people have been incredibly adaptive. There's been, in business and in society, incredible adaptation and great resilience, which should be a source of some optimism for the future. So just looking forwards, what's the next normal look like? What's next? Well, there are 5 areas of work that have been consistently busy and have kept our business going, frankly. And one obviously is health and medicine, which we saw in Mike's data. Social care is another, but also education, technology, and transport and logistics. I was slightly surprised to see transport showing a negative, because we've had incredible demand for not just drivers, but also bicycle couriers. I mean, there's a lot of work in delivering things, and I would expect that to continue, because I think shopping patterns have changed. I'd also say, though, and our data, our latest data, I'm just going to share with you the first 3 weeks of February, paint a more positive picture than the ONS data, perhaps because it's more recent, and I'm surprised by it, because the first lockdown was so harmful in jobs advertised. I'm quite surprised that the third one, we've actually seen an increase in jobs advertised, which suggests that we're emerging from the recession. So in the first 3 weeks of February, we saw 153,000 new jobs advertised, and that's up 14% on January, and up 4% on February last year. So more jobs even than the pre-pandemic period, although many people could see it coming. And so I would certainly endorse what Mike said. I call 2021 a year of movement. I think there is a lot of pent-up demand in the labour market. People are looking to move to new jobs, and people are looking to hire new people. So I think there's going to be a lot of mobility and movement this year. We did a survey at the beginning of the year in which 70% of people said that they would be prepared to change sector to get a new job, and even take less pay to do that if it was a job that was near a home that they preferred. And remarkably, given the world that you're in, 50% plus said they would be prepared to move home or move location. And that's much, much higher than we would have seen in the past. And I think that, just to summarize, there are 3 opportunities really longer term that we might wish to think about. Mike mentioned Kickstart and Restart. I think there's an opportunity here to create a new route-way into employment from education for people. I mean, many people go the sort of A-level university route, but 50% do not, and they're not well served. So it's possible that a sort of new version of Kickstart could be used as a gateway into work and apprenticeships for many people who don't want to or choose to go to university. So I think creating a new superhighway into work for people who don't want to go the traditional route would be a good thing. I think also that we have the opportunity to create new patterns of living and working, which would be better for family life, so that more people can exercise the possibility of working from home and are equipped to do so. And I think the office, I don't think the office will become redundant, but I think the office will become more of what I might call a collaboration space, where people go to meet, but don't necessarily expect to spend 8 or 9 hours a day sitting in the same chair. So I think offices will change, and I think it's an opportunity to create a better working pattern for people, which involves, more time perhaps working from home. And I think there's also a great opportunity to expand access to education, particularly digital education. One of the other surprises for us in this pandemic is the demand for our courses, and we have over 60,000 courses advertised on our website online. The demand for our courses really went through the roof almost immediately the first lockdown came in. So people are keen to learn new skills, and people are now able to access them. And so I think making sure that people are aware of that and people have the infrastructure to do that is really important. And these courses often are free of charge or cost £10 or £20, and they give people the opportunity to try out new things, explore new areas, and really decide where they want to take their career. So I think there are some positives out of this. And I hope, if we can embrace those positives, forgive me for saying this, that many more people will be loving Mondays. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, James. And I mean, a lot in there for us to pick up and discuss. I think we talked about aggregate changes in employment. I think the point you make about unequal impacts is really, really important. I think 3/5 of the drop in employment over the last year has been amongst young people, and you mentioned different geographies and different groups as well. So some questions coming through on the chat about some of those unequal impacts that we'll pick up, and do keep typing in your questions on the Q&A. We'll bring it through as many as we can. And I think actually it's good to be talking about opportunities and the sort of positive changes that are coming. I'm pretty sure at some point my doorbell is going to go with one of those deliveries that keeps popping up as vacancies on your website. So apologies in advance when that happens. So I think it's good for us to be focusing on some of those positive opportunities and how we make the most of them. So I'm going to bring on our next speaker now, and ask David Orr, who's the chair of Clarion Housing Association's board, to say a few words. And David, I'm sure many of you will know, was previously the chief exec of the National Housing Federation as well. And David, I'm sure you'll kind of have a real perspective on the impact of the pandemic on social housing tenants, and also what we can do to harness some of those opportunities and changes that James was talking about as well. So I'll pass over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to come along and speak at this event. I have spoken in the past at a few equivalent events, and I've always thought that the partnership between housing providers and those whose interest is in ensuring great routes into employment ought to be a marriage made in heaven. We have so many things that we have in common that I think this is a very important event. You will not be surprised to learn that people who live in housing association homes have been affected by the pandemic in much the same way that everyone else has been affected by it. The evidence is that housing association tenants are more likely to be in insecure gig economy jobs, or more likely to be, as James was saying, in face-to-face jobs. And many of those people have had particular challenges. And many people who live in housing association homes, I think, have found it difficult to do some of the things that we've asked, you know, the shielding, the social isolation, well, the physical distancing and isolation, because to do so means that they will have very little money coming in. Many of them have not been eligible for furlough. We all know the background to this. It's been a particularly high impact on young people, and all the issues about what's happened to the hospitality and social care industries, particularly hospitality, and how much of that will come back is going to be a real challenge. I think it's worth saying that the £20 uplift in universal credit, we absolutely need to retain it. Not because it has been a feature of unusual government generosity, but because before the £20 uplift, even without the pandemic, universal credit rates were too low. So that £20 ought to be the new base level, not seen as an addition that is being generously held on to. And I do think that if we are to build back better and come out of this pandemic, with a different kind of society, we do have to think about the balance of our economy. Who is most adversely affected? And as is always the case, the pandemic has once again demonstrated that the adverse effects are always worse for the people who have the lowest incomes, the people who live in the most overcrowded homes. I tweeted a couple of weeks ago in response to the news that another 1.7 million people have been asked to shield, that presupposes that our homes are safe places for us. And for far too many people, our homes are not, because they're damp or they're overcrowded or they're physically not safe. And if we are to make the best possible use of the opportunity to rethink that the pandemic has given us, I think we have to rethink how we plan our housing offer, how it relates to the employment offer. We shouldn't really be building small one-bedroom flats, because there's a very, very, very limited population of people for whom a small one-bedroom flat is the perfect place to work from, as well as live and be sociable in. We have to rethink. I loved James's quote from Arundhati Roy about this being a portal to the next world. I think this time last year, we were all reacting. Clarion, like many, many other organizations, reacted brilliantly. Everything went online, including our training offer, and that's been superb, and people have really benefited from it. 2,000 residents into work over the course of this 12-month period. And we've all realized that it is possible to do things in a way that was very different to how we'd done them before, but we've been reacting. When we get through the portal to the new world, I think the question is this a world that we're going to inherit from by accident, from things that happen just because they've happened and we've reacted? Or is it going to be a world that we play an active role in creating, imagining what this better world might look like? And organizations like Clarion, with the scale and the scope and the capacity that we have, but the housing association movement collectively, indeed, everyone who is part of this conference today can be part of that active thinking about reshaping the economy, reshaping the offer. We will do far more of our training and employment support offers through Clarion Futures online in the future. We will continue to support Kickstart. And I mean, that's been a great example of organisations working cooperatively. We are in Clarion taking 300 people directly ourselves. It is self-evident that Kickstart needs to run beyond the end of this year. Dabbling in things, starting and then stopping and starting and stopping is never a good outcome. And if you think about my last comment before we move into the broader discussion, but if you think about the opportunities for new work, the challenge of decarbonising 26 million homes in our economy is not just a huge challenge, it is a massive opportunity, not least to provide what could be 500,000 new jobs, new highly skilled jobs that make a real difference to people's lives.
Great, thank you, David. And I think the point about us choosing what the future looks like in that portal point is a powerful one, which I think we'll come back to. I think this time last year, Microsoft Teams was something that kept opening on my laptop and I didn't really know what it was, and I was about to ask our IT team, how do you turn it off? It turns out it's genuinely useful, and so we've all learned. Other platforms are available, I should say. So these things, we kind of learned some of this, and I think James was talking earlier about you know, we probably won't all stay at home zooming away all the time, but nor will we probably just go back and sit in rows of desks for 9 hours a day, having paid to get there. So how we choose, I think your point, David, about we choose that new normal is really important. And I'd endorse your point about universal credit as well, by the way, where that £20 uplift came after 5 years of working age benefit freezes that left our benefits relatively low compared to average earnings historically and to other countries as well. So suggestions in the press today of a 6-month extension. I think, I'm not sure what's going to be particularly different in 6 months' time, but we might discuss that with the minister later, you never know. Anyway, sorry, I've kind of started the next session now. Our last but not least, I wanted to introduce Jane Hickey, who's the Chief Executive of the Association of Employment and Learning Providers, which is the membership body for independent training providers. And Jane, I know you've previously worked for Groundwork and for a housing association as well, so you've got a bit of previous, if I can put it that way, within this sector. And I'm sure you'll kind of be interested in what James was saying about creating a sort of super highway into work and the role of apprenticeships in that, given apprenticeships for young people, for example, have gone from low to very low. So how do we do some of that? And then also your reflections more generally about kind of where we are and where we go next.
Okay, and first of all to say apologies, I'm going to have to jump off of the panel because in terms of packing things into a day, I've got my AGM in about 20 minutes time, followed by my board meeting. And one of the things about being online is that far more people are coming to our AGM than we've ever expected before. So I've just been with my chairman trying to work out how we manage that. And just a comment, I mean, it's fantastic to be in a conversation with like-minded people, actually, because we so often spend our time in you know, certainly at AELP, battling with officials about what should be done and finding ourselves coming away fairly disheartened, and to hear people talking in the same language and with the same thought is great. And actually, like you, Stephen, last year I had a new member of staff who loaded Microsoft Teams onto my computer, and it was driving me mad because it kept popping up, and I too said, can somebody remove this? You know, we now live for it. So my colleague Paul Warner is with us. So when I just give some reflections here, he's going to jump on and take the panel discussion for me with and for AELP. So just to I guess to start, I mean, I was going to cover a couple of things, and some of it is reflection about what's happened over the past year and how ALP members have responded to that. So there's kind of some views on how the government measures have what they've done to boost apprenticeships, then the way that we responded to the crisis, and then I think there's a little bit about how housing associations and training providers can work together and support ourselves out of this crisis. And as you said, Stephen, I worked for a large housing association in London. I was the director of regeneration there, and then at Groundwork. So I think that the things combined together to make quite a nice fit. So in the first lockdown, where we found ourselves was that the measures that had been put in place by the government were extremely disappointing, really, really slow, to the extent that Alp consulted with lawyers actually about the department's lack of initial support for apprenticeships. And we did that because of the impact that the lack of support was going to have on apprenticeships. And 7 out of 10 apprentices in England are delivered by independent training providers and not by public sector providers, but colleges who also train apprentices were frustrated. So we also saw new apprenticeship starts absolutely collapse. And so we spent quite a bit of time persuading regulators to allow for flexibilities in the rules relating to the delivery of training and assessment of learners. At one point, our list of requests to the SFA, the Institute for Apprenticeships, Ofsted and Ofqual was in a number of over 30. Slowly, some of those were agreed by the authorities, and we saw some success in the flexibilities being extended. And I have to say, I would echo what Mike has said and a couple of the other panelists have said as well, which is about the absolute need to extend these incentives. We would make a mention that Ofsted were absolutely amazing as an agency during this time. They recognised the challenges. They just basically suspended full inspections. They did interim inspections to support people for when we came back into a time when we'd be able to operate normally, so to speak, again, which was really helpful. So we did see in the end some support for non-levy apprenticeships and some flexibilities. And it was then when Treasury and Rishi Sunak's clear passion for apprenticeships was a real welcome move when he announced the plan for jobs, the 111 million for traineeships, 2,000 for employer incentives and young people, and the 1,000 incentive for each traineeship. At the same time, I think we might have a slightly different angle on Kickstart, which was we were concerned that was going to detract completely from apprenticeships. And so the push from AELP was and still is that Kickstart should be something that can flip over into an apprenticeship so that you have a guarantee of training in that programme. But absolutely, that an extension of those programmes should be in place. So in the context of all of that, our pre-budget submission to the government said they need to do more. We need to advocate wage subsidies for young people and for young apprentices, as do labour, and existing incentives and flexibilities need to be extended way beyond the 31st of July. We need to recognise the impact of this. And as others have said, it's a pandemic which has hit the most disadvantaged, and we need to be able to try to build that back and to provide the support in order to allow for that to happen. In terms of the response from training providers during this time, it's kind of been amazing in many ways. People have adapted, they've been really creative. We did a survey of our members last April, which showed that 81% of apprentices were actively learning after the first lockdown. And that was a result of providers just switching. Almost seamlessly. It wasn't seamlessly behind the scenes, but switching almost overnight to an online provision of learning and assessment resources. So it was a fantastic achievement, and I think, as others have said, people have adapted fairly quickly. And have been able to adjust to the way that we do things in quite a creative and an extraordinary way, which is not to say that that there aren't major challenges. And we see particularly in AELP that certain apprenticeships like dentistry, hairdressing and so on, the practical on the job learning and assessment can take place at home, although the advances in remote learning are there are some barriers as well. So at present, we're going to see the number of apprentices going beyond their planned end date grow to about 30% of many providers' total learner cohorts, which is a pretty high number. And as a result of the lockdown, we're also seeing apprentices needing more support. And I think one of the areas where we are having more conversation, but perhaps we need to make sure we keep having the conversation, is about well-being and mental health and what has happened to people in the lockdown and the impact of that on them. And Mike also mentioned the retraining. We need to allow for retraining for people so that they can upskill, switch skills, just open up that potential career pathway for them. So in terms of how training providers and housing associations can work together, I think it's collaborative, it's supportive. You know, training providers know what the incentives are. They can support around Restart, apprenticeships, traineeships, Kickstart. You know, you've unemployed adults also being able to benefit from retraining, though we think that needs to be adjusted as well. So I think it's about identifying common ground. It's identifying where, you know, it's a tapestry, isn't it? There are things that we can all bring to this, and if we come together and recognize what those things are, then I think that we can actually look fairly positively at, I think, what would have been 6 months ago a fairly bleak picture. So I think it's I think we need to approach it with optimism. So I'm going to leave it there.
Great, thanks, Jane. Thanks for that perspective, and also for reminding us that you are going to transform at some point in the next 20 minutes into Paul Warner, so no one gets surprised when that happens on the screen. Doctor Who style, perhaps. I want to overplay that one.
Okay, so, thanks, Stephen.
No, pleasure. Thank you. So we've got loads of questions coming through the Q&A, which is brilliant, and please do keep them coming in and voting on the poll, and I'll give the results of the polls towards the end of this session. I'm going to try and group together some of these questions because there's some common themes, I think. So we've got a question. There's questions around learning and how we build skills and how that's changing through the pandemic and that sort of growth in online learning in particular. So there's a question from Peter Lavender about long-term unemployment is expected to rise. In fact, Learning and Work Institute projections that we published recently suggest it could go above 1 million in the next week or so. The next year or so. It's about 500,000 at the moment. So how do we get learning opportunities that can really engage that group and help them with their employment prospects? And there's a question linked to that from Dominic Stay Nimble about digital learning being an opportunity, but lots of unevenness, and about the digital divide that's come up elsewhere as well. And so it's great that we take some of these things online, but how do people get access to it? I think, you know, we've been doing a survey of adults for a quarter of a century about learning, and we saw a real explosion in interest in online learning during lockdown and all kinds of different forms of learning. But that digital divide really sort of meaning some people can't engage with it. So how do we do something about that? So I might come to Ralph first, particularly on that digital divide point and what housing associations can and are doing about that, and then I'll come to James, because you talked about taking your learning offer online. To be great to get your thoughts on that. So Ralph first, if you can, please.
Thanks, Stephen, and what a question. It's the big challenge. Taking David Orr's point earlier about community design, we've got to think about the way our communities are built. And one of the things we've seen over the last few years, just before lockdown, we built a community in Borden. It had homework officers, it had fast broadband, it had a community cafe with employment and social isolation, sort of tackling facilities, and a great space for people to meet. It sold for the units that had to sell really quickly, and for the tenants there, absolutely no void turnaround, a really strong community. But that isn't possible everywhere, and the answer has to be collaboration. We have some tower blocks in Slough where we've put in communal Wi-Fi and linked a community together. But the truth is, it requires a whole range of organisations to link together. So we need to get smarter, work with partner housing organisations that share boundaries, make equal investment, link in with the big broadband and network providers, think about the spec of our homes, because home working, as James outlined, is going to be a key part of our future. But also, I think those community touchdown spaces are going to be really important, be they community resources, community cafes, however they're done. Our new developments can offer the opportunities for the community to share from that infrastructure investment.
Thanks, Ralph. And yes, over to you, James.
Well, I think that the digital inclusion agenda should be right at the top of the list, really, because it makes such a huge difference having access. I think housing associations can play a really, really important role in that, and I'm sure you will. I mean, it's just interesting. I've just pulled up the top courses that people are subscribing to. So the top 5 free courses, I thought you might be interested to know what they are. The top number 1 is Essential IT Skills, level 2. Number 2 is free online CS course, that's for construction work. Number 3, Business and Administration, level 2. Number 4, level 2 certificate in counselling skills. And number 5, HR fundamentals. And the top 3 subjects where we've had increases in visits and inquiries around NHS, warehouse, and interestingly, clinical psychology. And I'll just give you I think it's quite telling, actually. The top 5 paid for courses. Number 1 is British Sign Language, which surprised me when I first saw it. But it's actually a really good thing to learn because it's something you can work from home. It improves your skills as a communicator. And it's a very useful skill to have for the rest of your life. So British Sign Language is number 1. Then Understanding Anxiety, Depression, and CBT, which tells you how people are feeling. Leadership and Management, number 3. Project Management, number 4. And number 5 is Microsoft Excel, a complete course. So you can see how important the sort of digital subjects are as well. So I hope that gives you some insight.
Great, thanks, James. That's really helpful. And so I guess leading on from that, David, if I come across to you, because there's the digital divide point and how do we get people engaged and changing that, but there's a point sort of about wider divide. So for example, Deborah's asked a question about talking, whenever we get a recession, there's lots of people newly lose their jobs and policy goes to focus on them. Quite rightly, we need to help people who've lost their jobs. But do we risk that leaving those who were already out of work or disadvantaged in whatever way even further behind? So how do we make sure that we don't lose that focus on those who needed the help before the pandemic and don't leave them even further behind? And then there's also a linked question which I put to you about a couple of questions really that have sort of come up about the various complications in employment and skills schemes. There's I could reel off a list of acronyms and programs, but how do they actually join up, or how do we get what people need rather than asking people to fit around the policies? And housing associations have always played a really important role in doing that. So if I could ask you about how do we make sure we don't leave people even further behind, and also how do we try and make this an offer that works for people rather than a complicated list of government programs? 2 quite easy questions for you there. Yeah,
and the complete answer can be fitted on the back of a matchbox, obviously. Look, I mean, these are absolutely critical issues for us. One of my frustrations for years and years has been government by initiative. So something is around at a moment in time, and an initiative is created that runs for a little period of time, and then it stops because we've reached the next budget and the money's going somewhere else. We need to get away from all of that. I think that's one of the reasons why people have become trapped in longer term unemployment, because they do get left behind. They become part of the landscape and are not therefore a priority. The people who are the priority are the ones who are newly disadvantaged. And that doesn't make any sense if we're to make use of the best use of the potential that we have in our people right across the country. And I mean, I know this sounds a bit pie in the sky, but I really do believe that if we are to make the best of the opportunity that comes from having a kind of nation-changing event like the pandemic, it will come down to whether or not we are prepared to think creatively, to think strategically, to do that leadership thing about trying to imagine a future that's better than the present, and then creating the mechanisms that help us to get there, rather than limiting ourselves to saying, oh, that's a bit messy at the moment, let's do something that tidies up that mess and hope that we can just get back to how we used to be.
Thanks, David. I'm going to blame the audience for asking too many difficult questions that I'm putting across to you, but keep them coming, by the way. I'm going to put a similar point actually to Paul, if I may, who's now here in Jane's place. And Paul, the point about the number of initiatives going on and whether they're an offer or how we translate them into an offer that works for people rather than a list of initiatives that kind of accretes over time like the layers of sedimentary rock in a cliff. What's your kind of take on how we make that happen?
Yeah, Stephen, I mean, initiative-itis has been a consistent problem in across this sector for many, many years, and it's caused us a lot of head scratching down the years as well. I mean, Restart and Kickstart, for example, are really good examples about where we can begin to think about doing something a little bit different and going forward in a new way. Talking about the portal that James was talking about a little bit earlier on. We were talking to DWP officials earlier on, and I certainly got an impression from talking to them that there is a cohort of officials in there now that are beginning to understand in a way that I don't think was previously the case, that there is an overlap between just creating a system that gets people into work and then actually keeping them there and actually linking it properly with other programs that are available. Now, we've been talking, for example, we warned right at the start about Kickstart that what it might do would possibly displace apprenticeship provision, because employers looking in the short term would say, well, I'd rather have a 6-month subsidised somebody coming in rather than start my apprenticeship at the moment. The initial reaction was, no, that won't happen. And now we know, well, it is happening. That's exactly what's going on. That doesn't mean these things are mutually exclusive. I mean, if we actually think properly about how Kickstart can engage an employer, can engage a learner back into this process again, can move them into work, and then start to put the building blocks in place for a long-term career progression, you're actually starting to build a whole new model up, which we should have been doing years ago. But, you know, we are where we are. We're in a really good position to do that now because, as again, other members of the panel have said, we're in a position where people are starting to look and say, well, we don't necessarily need to do things the way we did them before. This is a really good chance to begin to restart what we're doing and remodel what we're doing and go forward in a way that actually integrates these things together much more effectively.
Thanks, Paul. And I think so. One of the things we've argued for a while, for example, is a youth guarantee or an opportunity guarantee to make sure that every young person's offered a job, training place or apprenticeship. Because I worry slightly at the moment. We've got loads of great initiatives that the government has introduced pretty quickly by historical standards, but actually some young people will miss out because they won't be in touch with any bit of the system. And we haven't got enough proactive engagement of them, and then also what you get offered might depend on which bit of the system you turn up in rather than what works best for you. And of course I've talked about young people there, but the same applies to other age groups as well. So perhaps if I can ask Ralph about your experience working with your tenants, how do you try and make sure that you've got the right set of tools available, but also that people get offered the support that works for them rather than just whatever any particular department happens to be offering at that point in time?
That's a really good question. It comes back to those principles of asset-based community development that I talked about in my introduction. It's about listening, and actually that's harder than it sounds, to actually hear what a community needs and respond to what they require rather than what we think they need to receive. And so, you know, you have to go into this with a good dose of humility. You have to show that you have no intention as an housing organisation of, you know, leading. It's about empowering. It's about empowering that community to develop ideas. And so in developing those plans I referred to, we took time, difficult though lockdown was, to go to communities, to go to representative groups, to engage with the council and employers and say, what does this area here require? You know, is this indeed an area you recognise? You know, is this community that people will identify with? What's required? And there's a mixture of resources that we've put together, and what we want to get to is a position where people can bid for resources rather than the organisation give continual grants. It's about people coming to us with ideas that we can, business cases that we can support, but it all has to start somewhere. So it's that kind of first critical mass, or critical spark, that gets the community to say, we've got an issue with this, how can you help us deliver the solutions that are needed? And so in areas like Portsmouth, working with Shaping Portsmouth, in South Somerset, working with the council there, we've picked key zones, key projects, be it about social isolation, be it about a sense of kind of community learning, access to training, access to online courses, access to materials, be it the internet or laptops. And then also that self-employment program I talked about, which has been about getting people, and it's all about confidence actually, confidence and opportunity to create that springboard that will help people get back into work.
Thanks, Ralph. And I'll give people a sort of last warning, last couple of minute warning to go and vote on the poll. I'm going to close that off in a couple of minutes time, and we'll put up the results. So if you haven't voted yet, click onto that and let's see what the results are in a short while. But the sort of next group of questions that's kind of come through, I'm going to put to James and David first, if I may. And they're really about the sort of quality of work and progression once you're in the workplace. And this was something like before the pandemic, employment was relatively high. I mean, there were still groups missing out, we could go further, but a lot of attention was starting to focus on good work and progression and security and those sorts of things. And you know, we run a Better Work network, for example, to help. We've got about 300 people, members of that, sharing best practice on that sort of thing. So what, in terms of the pandemic being a portal to the future and we can choose that future, what do we need to do in terms of looking at the quality of work? Or is it a case of we need to get people quickly back to work so we don't get a long-term unemployment problem building up, and then we can kind of focus on that thereafter? How do we approach that quality of work issue? So James first, and then David, please.
I think it's a really good question, an important question. But I think it is preceded by this growing concern that we're going to have a lot of people potentially unemployed for very long periods of time. And, you know, the 2 million that have either been furloughed or unemployed for, you know, over a year, as was mentioned earlier by Mike, is serious. And I think I've been working, you know, in this welfare to work sector since the late 1990s, and the effects of long-term unemployment, we don't need me to tell you, are terrible on individuals and their families and on the wider community. So that is I think our first challenge. But what I say is, you know, if you can get into work, I like people to try and think about it as a job, a better job, a career. You know, think of it as a starting point. You know, you don't have to confine yourself to what it is that you've got right now or what the opportunity you've just managed to secure. You can move on and you can move up. And I think what's different now to the late 1990s is there's so much more access to learning, as we've just been talking about. You can upskill, you can reskill in your own time and in your own space relatively easily if you have digital access, as we've just been talking, then in a way that you could not before. So I think getting into work is really important for people's health and well-being. And I would make that the first point of focus, and then improve the work where we can. I think that should certainly happen too.
I mean, I do agree that getting people into a job is going to be absolutely critical. On a number of occasions where I've spoken at events celebrating the achievements of people who are apprentices in housing associations, I have said, don't just think of yourself as being an apprentice in the business department or an apprentice in the IT department. Think of yourself in the first stage of your apprenticeship towards becoming the chief executive. Because I think so much of this is about helping people to understand their own potential and encouraging their own ambition. And then I think there is an absolute obligation on employers, and particularly large-scale employers, and Clarion, you know, employs 3,500 people. We need to have a generosity about investing in our people so that they can generate their own growth and development in our organisation, but also so that they can take what they have learned and generate that growth somewhere else. And then we, in our turn, hope that we will be able to pick up people who have gone through that process somewhere else. We have to stop being very focused on just our own needs and be much more generous about understanding that if we equip the whole economy better, we will actually be equipping every single individual business better.
Thanks, David. We're into the last few minutes of the session now. So I'm going to bring the polls up in a moment and see what the results are. But I'm going to give you all fair warning that after those poll results, I'm going to just come to each of you with just a last quick question about, we're going to be hearing from the Minister next in DWP, and we've already talked about the fact there's a budget next week. So here's your chance to say if there was one thing you wanted the government to do, whether it's in the budget next week or more generally to try and get people back to work and increase in employment, what would that thing be? So I'll give you fair warning to think about that. And if we could bring up the result of the first poll, please. So which of the following best, so what's your view of the plan for jobs? So I think the sort of consensus there is a good start, but there's going to need to be more to be done so that we don't end up with a sort of long-lasting employment crisis. So yeah, more to do. And the good news is that the second poll gives people's answers about what the extra things to do should be. So if we could bring that up, please. So we only gave you a limited set of options. There's probably a million other things, and I'm sure those will come through the Q&A and Twitter as well. So fair, not a kind of overwhelming response. Oh, there you go. It's kind of changed. There's live democracy in action there as we see the results changing. But the lead option, invest more in creating jobs. I think that's a point that's come through a lot of the discussion so far. Is it's protecting jobs is really important, and the furlough scheme's done a brilliant job, I think. And employment support's really important, but we need to have the jobs for people to go into. And we talked a bit about how the economy is changing, and linked to that, how we help people to retrain. And again, we talked a bit about that and the sort of online learning and things like that, and so some support for the continuing that increase in universal credit, which I would endorse that as well. So there we go. That's kind of give some prompts for each panelist's answers to my final quick fire question, and also for the Minister who we'll hear from shortly. So what's the one thing you think the government should be doing to try and get people back to work and reduce unemployment? So if I go to Paul first.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about needing to. There's a load of things that we could ask the government to do, but if there's one, I think the overall thing is we need to stop thinking about programs that just get people into work, and then we'll think about consolidating it with learning and progression later. It's perfectly possible to do both at the same time. Kickstart is a really good example of that. If there was one thing I was going to ask, we would ask, it would be to flex the subsidy with Kickstart, so that if it does convert into an apprenticeship, that subsidy can still continue, that the employer can still get that benefit of the subsidy whilst the person concerned actually starts on the apprenticeship program. At the moment, it flips over and the incentive stops. That's an unnecessary disjunct. It wouldn't cost any more money. That would be an easy thing to do.
Okay, thank you. Ralph, next, please.
Full furlough counts towards Kickstart or Restart eligibility, and that plea for long-term funding through partnerships with opportunities for obviously communities at work and organisations to make a collaborative difference.
Excellent, and well done for getting 2 in there as well. And James, next, please.
I'd like to see more work on creating this super highway for people to progress from education into employment through potentially a version of Kickstart and then an unleashing of apprenticeships. I think when we heard earlier from Jane about how that had been sort of a problem, I think that's something that can be fixed and it can make a huge difference.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. and David.
So other panelists have spoken about specific things, absolutely right. I think there is a huge amount of willingness to work collaboratively, to work together to improve the prospects of people in jobs and in the economy. And my plea to government would be, can we have a clearly defined strategy where we have some sense of shared objectives that we can all get behind and work together in a kind of common task of helping people get back into good quality jobs?
Thanks, David. I think that's been an absolutely fabulous discussion. We've covered a lot of ground there. I'm very grateful to all of our panelists for their contributions. This is the point where normally the audience of sort of 300 people or so we've got logged on would all be applauding, but I'm afraid you'll have to take the silent acclamation of Twitter. But thank you so much for your time and contributions to a really great discussion. My last task before I pass over to the next session is just to open up the third poll. If we can just show that on the screen, please. Which is, do you agree with the statement that government and housing associations work effectively together? And you can kind of see the various options there between agreeing and disagreeing. So please do click in and vote on that poll, which we'll keep open for a bit. And I'd already mentioned that our next session is with the Minister. So we're very grateful to Will for joining us. And I'm going to pass over to Fiona Aldridge, Learning and Work Institute's Director of Policy and Research, to chair this session. So over to you, Fiona.
Thank you, Stephen. It's great to be here. Thank you for the panel for a really stimulating discussion. I'd like to welcome Will Quince to deliver the keynote address. Will's been a Member of Parliament for Colchester since 2015, and in April 2019 was appointed Minister for Welfare Delivery. So he is responsible for the management and delivery of universal credit, supporting disadvantaged groups and tackling poverty. Will, it's great to have you with us. Can I invite you to deliver our keynote address?
Thank you, Fiona. That's very kind. And good morning, everyone. And I'm delighted to be here today, albeit virtually, to speak to you about the importance of housing, learning and employment, and how the Department for Work and Pensions is working in partnership to support individuals. And with the successful rollout of the vaccine nationwide, I hope it won't be too long before we're able to meet in person again. And I have to sort of give a warning in advance, like so many parents up and down the country, I'm also homeschooling today. So I apologise in advance if you see any little people in the background or we have any interruptions, but hopefully not. I've managed to bribe them suitably with snacks, so hopefully we'll be okay. Thank you, Fiona, for the very kind introduction. And as Fiona said, I'm joining you today as the Minister for Welfare Delivery. And as Fiona rightly pointed out, I have responsibility for housing within our benefit system, universal credit and support for vulnerable groups within the Department for Work and Pensions. And I'd like to start by thanking the Learning and Work Institute and also Communities That Work for inviting me here today. And I also want to thank and put on record my thanks to housing associations and charities for all of the work that you've done supporting people through the pandemic, and more broadly, the work that you do empowering people to change their lives for the better, and the support for you give us as a department in making that happen. And I'm particularly happy to support you all in this endeavour, as I'm really passionate, absolutely passionate about all things housing. And before I was elected as a Member of Parliament, I worked as a property solicitor, and I was an elected local councillor. And before being appointed as a minister, I co-chaired the Ending Homelessness All-Party Parliamentary Group. And since my appointment as a minister back in April 2019, I've worked really closely with charities and other organisations to help inform my work and the work of the department to ensure that from a DWP perspective, we are playing our part in cross-government efforts to provide greater stability through housing and employment. And these organisations possess expertise and resource which make a direct positive contribution to our claimants and to job seekers. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown us more than ever the important role that housing associations play in supporting communities. And in many of these communities, there is clear deprivation, with people facing barriers such as poverty, unemployment, social exclusion, a lack of qualifications and training, and diminished community and personal resilience. But universal credit's effectiveness has also been demonstrated in response to the pandemic, and UC has managed an unprecedented spike in demand. And we set out from the very beginning of the pandemic to make processing of claims and paying people quickly the top priority of the department. And we now have 6 million people on universal credit as a result of the latest statistics, which is a 98% increase since March 2020. And I'm actually very proud to say that over 91% of new claimants have consistently received their payments on time and in full throughout the pandemic. And universal credit, I think, with the support of thousands of DWP staff that I have to pay tribute to, has stood up to the test of the past year. Now, prevention is very much at the heart of this government's approach as a whole, and we offer support to those living chaotic lifestyles from becoming homeless, including universal credit continuing to be paid for up to 6 months for those in drug and alcohol recovery, and retained housing costs for prisoners serving short sentences to protect them from becoming homeless on release. And during the pandemic, our focus has been on supporting people initially to get the money they need, and UC has shown itself to be a resilient and scalable benefit system. But now all of our focus is on supporting people to find work in what is without question a very much a changing environment. Now, it won't have escaped your notice because it was a very big and highly trailed speech. On Monday, the 22nd of February, the government published its step-by-step roadmap plan to for the easing of restrictions in England, cautiously starting with education. And the devolved administrations are setting out separate plans for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Recognising the importance of clarity for those who live and work in different parts of the UK, particularly in cross-border communities, the government will continue to work closely with the devolved administrations. And housing associations will play a key role as they often help people to develop financial management skills, ensuring residents can access benefits and help to build employment skills. Across 4 steps, the roadmap sets out sequencing and indicative timing for the easing of restrictions. And this is a cautious and gradual approach led by data, not dates. Now, in my own constituency in Colchester, our local Job Centre Plus has a very positive relationship with several housing associations. And since the rollout of universal credit in 2018, that's become even more important. And those include Colchester Borough Homes, Swan Housing and Eastlight Community Homes, amongst others. And it's these kind of close working relationships between Job Centre Plus and housing associations that are repeated across the country, ensuring that colleagues can support claimants with their benefits and housing needs. And at a moment in time when many of us have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, it's important for government, private and voluntary organisations to pull together as we move into recovery. And it was brilliant to see firsthand a virtual classroom in action as part of the Transform and Achieve programme that I participated in October of last year. And at the Communities That Work, Transform and Achieve online event back in November, where I was kindly invited to give a keynote speech, I also thank JP Morgan for their vital support of this important programme. The Department for Work and Pensions is committed to supporting those who've been affected by the unprecedented impact of COVID-19 on the economy and on the labour market. And we want everyone to be able to find a job, to progress in work and to thrive in the labour market, whoever they are or wherever they live. And nationally, our work coaches have been doing the most incredible job in supporting people through vital conversations, putting job centres at the heart of communities as we rebuild our economy. And I'm pleased to say we're well on track and well on the way to delivering on our commitment of recruiting an extra 13,500 new work coaches this financial year, which is pretty much a doubling of the number of work coaches. There is no question this government is serious about investing in our young people and their futures, and we've invested around £30 billion in measures to create support and protect jobs. And this included over £3 billion of investment from the DWP in the Kickstart programme, as well as other measures that are focused on boosting work search, skills and apprenticeships. Now, after the spending review, we agreed an additional £2.9 billion funding for the Restart programme to support people to find work quickly by providing intensive and tailored support to over 1 million people in England and Wales who have been unemployed for over 12 months. And an additional 17 million to support 32,000 more vocational places in 2021-2022. And this has been extended with a further increase of 80,000 places for the next financial year. We then have sector-based work academy placements, or SWAPs, which will offer training, work experience and a guaranteed job interview to those ready to start a job. And the new £2 billion Kickstart scheme, which I just mentioned, offering high quality 6-month work placements from autumn 2020, which will create hundreds of thousands of new fully funded jobs for young people right across the country. In addition, we're providing 150 million of extra funding for the Flexible Support Fund that will support the work of Job Centre Plus, helping local areas purchase bespoke local provision and enabling the removal of barriers people may face with starting work. And those can be as simple as purchasing clothing or equipment, or paying for travel costs for the first 3 months, for example. And this is further complemented by the government introducing the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, or the UK SPF, from 2022, which will provide up to £1.5 billion in targeted investment and bespoke employability and skills support for people and places most in need across the UK. So to help local areas prepare over 2021-2022 for the introduction of the UK SPF, the government will provide around 220 million in additional funding to support communities across the UK to pilot programmes and new approaches. And our Good Place to Start campaign also launched in the summer, which signposts job seekers to our Job Help website. It's been a really challenging year, but I'm extremely proud of the work that the department has done and our support in ramping up, putting job centres at the heart of communities and keeping the Department of Work and Pensions at the forefront of our response. But I think, as I've stressed, I hope I've stressed throughout this so far, we can't do it alone, and we must all work together in partnership. Employers, providers, government, local authorities, housing associations, charities, and of course organisations present at this virtual event today to deliver a comprehensive and coordinated support package. And there is no question there is still far more to do, and I endeavour to continue to work with stakeholders to address issues and improve the systems that we have in place for our claimants. And as many of you know, my door is always open to new ideas. I think officials are sick and tired of me keep accepting all of these meetings because the diary is always so full, but it's really important because it's how you get that experience from the grassroots and have an understanding of what's going on the ground. I'd like to close by saying, having personally seen how programmes provided by housing associations work in action, not only supporting individuals, but also how you are all working in partnership with government, I'm so fully supportive of this, and I will continue to work with you to drive forward this important agenda. So thank you again, Fiona, and everyone for having me today. I have no doubt that together we can build back better following this pandemic.
Thank you. That's great, and we're certainly pleased that you accepted this invitation, so thank you very much. Mintra, could we have the results of the final poll, please, before we go on to questions? And can I just encourage you that if you have any questions for the Minister, to pop them in the chat box. So we were looking at the extent to which we agreed with the following statement, which is around government and housing associations working effectively together. That's a bit of a split poll, isn't it? Because just under 30% disagree, but growing 26%. So roughly the same proportions agree and disagree, and then a similar proportion neither agree nor disagree. So really split position there. And if you've got specific questions or comments about that, it'd be great for you to put them in the chat so we could unpick some of that. So could I ask you, Will, what you think needs to be done in order for government and housing associations to work more effectively together? So perhaps thinking about the Kickstart and Restart programmes, or perhaps, when those programmes are over, we need to put in place some long-term collaboration to sustain those relationships. What do you think we can do now, and what might we do in the long run?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And although that poll result there is somewhat disappointing, it's not overly surprising. But what I would say is if you'd have gone back 2 or 3 years, I suspect it would be far, far worse. And we have come on such a long way over the course of the past 18 months or 2 years in terms of that closer working between government and housing associations, and in particular, the Department of Work and Pensions and housing associations. In terms of the way forward, I think it's twofold. And yes, we need to do far more centrally around some of these big national schemes like Kickstart and the other elements of the Plan for Jobs, and making sure that they're incorporated into our work with housing associations. But actually, in my experience, some of the best work between housing associations and the department are work at a local level, not at the sort of big national head office level. And that's why actually the increase in the flexible support fund from £40 million to £150 million, I think is so exciting, because that fund is where we can commission local services and local provision, because actually it is housing associations and local authorities largely that best know the needs and requirements, and indeed challenges and barriers to entry for employment of their local community. And we can get a pretty good idea about that sitting based in London, but actually it's those local connections and partnerships that are really making the difference. And I think what I've certainly seen over the past couple of years in this role is far more outreach work between Job Centre Plus and individual housing associations. And of course, housing associations come in all shapes and sizes. Some of you are huge and some are actually very small and cover just small areas of the country. But I think it is the local partnership working that will yield the best results. But nevertheless, there is a place for the bigger programs. And I think things like, and I know Lindsay's particularly passionate about this, things like Jobs Plus, they present really exciting opportunities for collaboration. And I hope next time we have another one of these conferences in person, that will be more like 50, 60, 70% will say that the collaboration and partnership working is improving. And then I hope it will continue to grow, because it's definitely the way forward.
Great, thank you. And you'd addressed my next question, which was about the Shared Prosperity Fund, which was really good to hear you mention, and also whether Jobs Plus might be have a role within that. What role do you see housing associations playing within the Shared Prosperity Fund?
Well, it's quite a significant one. And actually, I think I've been so impressed in terms of what I've seen so far in terms of yes, of course, it's patchy around the country and everyone does things slightly differently. But actually, it is largely housing associations that are leading by the front in terms of providing support for their tenants, which landlords across the country can't and would never be expected to provide. And it's that added value service. So I think absolutely the UK Shared Prosperity Fund has a part to play. As Lindsay knows, I'm a big passionate advocate for Jobs Plus too, and I see housing associations as the natural partner there. And I think for me, we talk about employability, but actually, and we talk about work search and CV building, and these are all really important. But actually, some of the best skills which housing associations can help to build within their those that they support are actually softer skills around confidence and around resilience and around financial management. And these are things that you wouldn't necessarily automatically associate with employability. And you put that to the Treasury and they would say, well, what's confidence building got to do with it? Well, actually, it's hugely important. And I remember being on, this was actually, I was present at shows how long ago it was, at a Transform and Achieve session in London in person. And I remember speaking to one of the tenants, and she'd worked all her life, I think for 30 odd years, managing a youth centre. And she was sadly made redundant, and she just didn't know what she could do or the skills that she had. And she worked with Lorenzo. I don't know if Lorenzo's on this, but he's absolutely incredible, and works on the program. And he managed to actually bring out of this lady that actually she had the most incredible wealth of transferable skills that she didn't know she had. And all of a sudden she was applying for jobs she'd never have dreamt of applying for before. And actually it is about, I think, some of those courses that are run by housing associations that actually empower people to give them the confidence and take back control of their lives and to reach that little bit further and further than they would have done otherwise, it actually gives us a huge boost in terms of the support, what we can do in terms of when they arrive at the job centre and the support that we can provide via work coaches. So I suppose that was a long answer to what was a short question. I think housing associations have done and will continue to play a really important and key role working in partnership with the department in helping support individuals. And of course, it doesn't have to be just your tenants. And I know housing associations through these programmes work with the wider community too. Hugely important. And I see it only going from strength to strength and growing.
Thank you. At the start of the conference, we heard quite a lot about, I suppose, the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on particular groups of people, particularly on the low paid, on those working in certain sectors. And I think the conclusion was very much that those who were most disadvantaged before the pandemic have often been hardest hit. And that's particularly the case for many social tenants. So when we looked at the actions for government, so investment in skills, job creation, universal credit, there's quite a lot of support for all of those. We've done some work at Learning and Work Institute with low paid workers and a report with Gingerbread on lone parents. And one of the key recommendations there was that we need a welfare system that provides a good level of effective support for people who are low paid or out of work, including making the £20 increase to universal credit permanent and thinking about other legacy benefits as well. Do you think this is something that we'll see in the budget, and what other measures might we see that would help those who have been most affected?
Yeah, so I mean that certainly is true, and actually I think some of the local solutions in terms of supporting particular communities that have been hardest hit by the pandemic are going to be really important. And in part of our efforts in terms of nearly doubling the number of work coaches is in part also around progression, because we know around 40% of those on universal credit are in work but in relatively low paid work, and we very much take an ABC approach, which is a job, a better job, and then a career. We don't just want to get somebody into a job and then that's it, support's cut off and you won't have an ongoing relationship with your work coach. We want to support people into better jobs, better paid jobs, and then ideally jobs they really want to do and careers. In terms of the £20 uplift, I'm afraid you will have to wait until next Wednesday, in part because the Chancellor wouldn't forgive me for announcing anything ahead of that, and also in part because I haven't been told yet, which is not uncommon because the Chancellor keeps these things very close to his chest. But actually what I would say is we're working very, very closely with the Chancellor and have been for the past 6 months on this issue. And I don't know if I could give you any kind of level of comfort other than to say that I think throughout this pandemic, we've invested around £280 billion to support individuals, businesses, jobs and livelihoods. And that included an additional £7 billion boost into our welfare system, which was largely made up of the universal credit uplift of £20 per week. And of course, the local housing allowance increase, which was an extra £1 billion, which has been carried on for this next year in cash terms. So the Chancellor hasn't flinched in terms of the request that we've put in for supporting the poorest, lowest paid, most vulnerable and disadvantaged in society throughout this pandemic. Yes, we've got light at the end of this tunnel via the vaccine, which is the rollout's going incredibly well. But people are still facing significant financial disruption, and I don't see the Chancellor stopping that support at this point. But that's probably as far as I can go. In terms of the broader point about legacy benefits, I mean, legacy benefits were increased by CPI last year at 1.7%. They were increased by CPI again from April at 0.5%. And anybody that thinks they may be better off, of course, on universal credits can now apply and move over from legs. They were the only people that couldn't were those that were subject to the severe disability premium and the gateway, but that's now been removed as of the end of last month. So anybody can move over. And I would just encourage, because I know the organisations will support many people in that endeavour, to go on to gov.uk, use one of the benefits eligibility checkers, because once you do make an application to move from legacy benefits to universal credit, there is no turning back. So it's very important that people check their eligibility first. And you can do that via the eligibility checkers, which are independent benefit calculators on the gov.uk website.
Thank you. A question from the audience about those furthest away from the labour market and those who now, perhaps because of furlough or perhaps because they were unemployed even before the crisis, are actually, now facing long-term unemployment. What will DWP do to ensure that they are not forgotten in the moves to focus on those who need to change career or have recently been made unemployed? We need to ensure that we don't forget those who were already facing quite a difficult situation. What's DWP's plans for them?
Well, that's a great question, and that's very much my job. In that we have so I don't deal with the plan for jobs. That falls under the Minister for Employment, Mims Davis. So she has the responsibility for all these large programs, but I have responsibility for vulnerable and disadvantaged groups within Universal Credit and our wider benefit system. So that includes care leavers, prison leavers, survivors of domestic abuse, to some extent also veterans and many more besides. And I've always been clear from the beginning that actually there is always a danger that when to be frank, we saw an extra 3 million people come onto universal credit over the course of the past year. There is always going to be a concern that any government would focus on the low-hanging fruit and getting as many people back into work as possible. Now, the honest answer is we're absolutely going to do that, because the vast majority of people actually only need quite light touch support to get back into work. In fact, the vast majority of people on universal credit are champing at the bit. They're desperate to get back into work. We just need a labour market that facilitates that, and the jobs are available for them to move into. So although we're doubling the number of work coaches, we are also aware that a lot of people who are new to UC, and bear in mind about 50% of those on UC are completely new to it and new to the benefit system, aren't going to need an awful amount of intensive support, but yet we are doubling the number of work coaches. So we are going to have that ability to provide more intensive support to those who do need it. And that's why we've got programs like Restart, which is the £2.9 billion scheme, which is very much designed for the long term unemployed. And we continue, and there are some things that we've gone throughout throughout the pandemic, which we've actually been able to accelerate. So for example, our work on prison leavers, which we'd already run 3 pilots on a telephony service for universal credit, so trying to reduce reoffending, getting people quickly onto benefits, so to reduce reoffending and then into work. We're now running pilots in 19, we've rolled that out permanently now, and we're now running further pilots around additional support for prison leavers in 19 prisons, supporting 100 people in each prison over the course of the next year. So there are some really exciting projects going on, and I've been absolutely clear with Mims that despite all of the work to get those closest to the labour market back into work, we've also got to make sure that we redouble our efforts on those that are furthest away from the labour market, because actually it's those individuals that you can really turn around their life and their life chances by supporting them and empowering them into work. Very often with complex needs and all sorts of other vulnerabilities and difficulties, which are going to need some very intensive support. But nevertheless, very important that we do prioritise those groups.
That's great, thank you. And just a final question. I suppose the purpose of this event is to bring together those sectors of housing and learning and work that sometimes can operate separately, but actually there's so much more to be gained if we work together. What's your sort of one commitment to the housing sector, but also your one ask of it?
So that's a really good question. So I think that my commitment to the housing sector is to continue to work with you to in effect forge those relationships at a local level, which are going to lead to those long-term partnerships, and make sure that poll you just did is significantly better when we meet again. I suppose my ask is that you continue to engage with Job Centre Plus, in particular at a local level. Build those local relationships with your Job Centre manager, with the outreach workers. We've got a lot of additional staff now, which is brilliant, but it is going to mean additional opportunities for outreach work. So get them out to you, you go into them. The better we understand each other's joint customer base, if you like, the better we are going to be able to support them, making sure people are on the right benefits and what they're entitled to, that we are getting them support, that we're not duplicating efforts, that if you've got some really good ideas that you think are scalable and are working and we can demonstrate outcomes, well, don't keep them to yourselves. Let's share that across other housing associations and get it rolled out wider, be it a pilot or a test case, or indeed let's just get these things rolled out. I think the pandemic has given us an opportunity, to squeeze a bit more money out of Treasury than we ordinarily would have been able to, but also to just just get on and do things. And I think as long as we sort of approach things with that spirit, a sort of can-do attitude of collaboration and joint working and working together in partnership, that is how I want to see that poll you just did turn around for the next one.
Now that sounds great. It's a great note to end on, and maybe you can come back next year and we can give you that same poll again, hopefully with some improved results. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're really pleased to have you contribute to our event. Can I just say to the rest of the audience that we now have a 20-minute break before we move into breakout sessions. So have a look at your interactive programme for links to the sessions. They'll take place in Zoom from 11:50, so from 10 to 12, and we'll drop these into Slido in the minute so that you can see further details. I'd really like to thank all of our speakers this morning, and to our group sponsors, City and Guilds, Clarion Futures, Metropolitan Thames Valley and Sovereign. Thank you so much for your support, and final thanks to our lead supporter, ABRI. So please now enjoy a 20-minute comfort break. Check out our on-demand content where you have a hot drink and a snack, and I look forward to seeing you in the breakout rooms. Thank you very much.